does not believe the eco-socialist notion that we need to shut down markets and stop growing in order to attack the serious problem of climate change. So what we're going to suggest in this debate is a market mechanism to attack climate change, namely carbon trading. At the moment, countries are looking for a replacement for Kyoto, so we're going to propose a treaty which can be signed by countries, but also states and cities, a mechanism by which we think we can get a lot of America, the big states like California and Massachusetts, for example. What we're going to require is, for these countries, the largest companies and governments, if the governments are involved in industry, will be required to sign up to a system where they must buy credits from a central authority in order to have the right to produce carbon dioxide. These credits will be capped at a level that will reduce the amount of global warming produced by these countries, especially over time as they get reduced. These credits will not be given as they were under the EU system, which didn't work very well. They will have to be bought by the companies. The money that's raised by selling these will largely go towards monitoring the carbon dioxide reductions of these companies, but also go towards clean development projects in the third world, investing in wind technology, solar technology and so on in growing third world countries like China and India. I've got 3 points to say about this. Firstly, I'm going to briefly talk about the gravity of the threat. Secondly, the incentives for companies in terms of their use of resources. And thirdly, the ability to transform economic growth over a whole economy. Bob, and the second speaker, is going to talk about the impact on the third world. In terms of the gravity of the threat, we hope we don't have to go too far in that. We hope this old stonewalling arguments have been in God, ladies and gentlemen. There's a scientific consensus that global warming is real, it's man-made, and the effects will be catastrophic if we do not shut it down, ladies and gentlemen. Water shortages, reclaimed land by the oceans, whole nations such as the Maldives and Fiji disappearing beneath the waves, ladies and gentlemen. We must act on this, but we should not act by stopping economic growth. Growth pulls us out of poverty. Growth is what gives us a belief that we can make a better life for ourselves and for our children and for our community. So we want something that allies growth and tackling the problem of climate change. Accept it.
Thanks. You conceded that you believe that to a certain extent polluters should pay for what they pollute by paying for this kind of trading. Why should we impose punitive measures that will actually reduce carbon emissions overall rather than trade them around?
Okay, think about punitive measures. It's not clear what sort of punitive measures you're suggesting, but if you're going to suggest just limits, that's extremely inflexible. If you look at all the companies in the world, they have such different needs, different sizes, it's going to be such a huge regulatory framework. If you're calling about a taxation-based system to tax carbon, we say the problem with that essentially is there's no property rights involved. All it takes is a right-wing government coming in and who doesn't believe in this sort of thing, and they just reduce the pollution taxes back down again. Once people own carbon credits, they're not willing to let them go, because they own them, they have real financial value, and for this reason, this is a system that will stick. My second point is the incentives for the company in terms of the use of resources. Once you have a cost to polluting, whether you do it with taxation or with our model, you've got a cost on bads rather than a cost on goods such as profit and so on and so forth. That means there's more incentive to invest in clean energy. That means there's more incentive to invest in technology to bring about clean energy. And it also means there's more incentive to bring about conservation. We already see this with the Kyoto Protocol. Because of the Kyoto Protocol and some countries wanting to do more to create clean energy, already 10% of venture capital in the United States that's going to other countries is for clean energy projects. The effect of this has been extraordinary. In the last 10 years, because of technological advances, the ability of wind power to produce power cheaply has halved, or doubled if you look at it the other way, from 8 to 10 cents per kilowatt hour to 3.5 to 4 cents per kilowatt hour. That's pure technological advance, because people see there's declines, there's money in being green. This is the kind of incentives we promote. But thirdly, let's look broader at the economies that are involved in this that still want to grow. Basically, to grow, you need economic inputs. And as anyone who's done a sort of economics lesson knows, there's 4 such inputs. There's land, there's labour, capital, entrepreneurship. Now, as I've already said in my previous point, substitution of different types of land or conserving the amount of land you use, land meaning natural resources more generally, is one option. But another option is to move your emphasis to the other types of inputs. In particular, we think this will spur on a knowledge economy that will create massive economic growth in terms of entrepreneurship. We think this will create more incentive to bring in more labour, more employment, accepted on the closing tee.
Okay, what makes you think though the big businesses just won't factor this cost into their running costs and therefore not actually reduce their emissions?
Well, I mean, obviously they'll factor the cost in, but the point is, big businesses who do say, I think I'll reduce my carbon, will make lots of money because they'll be able to sell their carbon credits on to the big businesses who don't want to reduce their production. So yes, some companies will make the decision, it's just impossible for us to reduce carbon, but that's okay, as long as carbon production is going down across society, ladies and gentlemen, going down across the globe. So, wrapping my third point up, the point is that this will create an incentive to use less land as well as better sorts of land, move companies on to growing labour in terms of more jobs, and entrepreneurship in terms of better technologies, better ideas, which is the major driver of economic growth all over the first world and also the third world, as we'll talk about. So for these reasons, because it's a grave threat, but we just can't give up on growth. Because we want to make the incentives for the company right in terms of use of natural resources and also in terms of substituting other economic inputs in for natural resources, we believe that we must propose this motion.
Ladies and gentlemen, they want a carbon trading system because it's an economic incentive. But the fact is, it's an economic cop-out because it's not a very good economic incentive. What we'll be talking about in this debate is that if you want an economic incentive, then it must be universal. You can't have some companies innovating and other companies becoming ghettos elsewhere in the world where they can still pollute pretty much as much as they want by getting out of it and by buying themselves out of it. What we're going to propose in this debate is a flat carbon tax. The reason for that is, it is an economic incentive that every company and every nation has to get behind. So we're not just moving where the carbon dioxide is emitted around the globe and having, ironically, as the first being for the proposition admitted might happen, different governments in different places, say changing government, and then say raising that limit that people can actually emit, say selling out more carbon emissions, and more carbon credits at whatever price they want to. We don't want that kind of flexibility, because that kind of flexibility is going to kill our world. No thank you. What I'm going to talk to you today is firstly, why taxation is a more direct and a more beneficial economic incentive. Secondly, I'm going to deal directly with some of the matter that we've had from the proposition by saying that it's a more direct incentive for more widespread innovation. And lastly, I'm going to talk about how substitution of flexibility, which are the main buzzwords that we hear in terms of a carbon tax, simply don't work, and they'll lead to more carbon dioxide emissions. This is a cop-out of a model. This is not actually helping our world. So let's move on to the first issue, why taxation is more important. I'm going to take you there.
The point about carbon, as opposed to some other forms of pollutant, is it doesn't matter where it's emitted. It all goes up into the atmosphere, ladies and gentlemen. So it's about bringing it down across society, and it doesn't matter if one company produces more.
That's very, that's a very, very short-term and naive approach. It does matter how certain countries develop and how certain places in the world develop. When we look at China, when we look at India, when we look at the re-emergence of Russia into the international economy, it does matter that while they are developing and while their economics are growing, that they do so in a clean way. Because it would be too late to say to them later on, when we've been giving them all these credits, when later on we're just saying, now when you've reached the level where we can't just give you any credits anymore, that they then suddenly have to switch to an actual emission reduction. We say that as old reactors get changed to new reactors, you have to always go with a cleaner technology. And that's why a carbon tax is utterly necessary. Because you have to look at the level of an individual firm. And what happens, we're mostly, in a lot of parts of the world, talking about the production of electricity, or talking about the production of power, or the production of major industrial objects. So what we're talking about here is that when it comes to the cost-benefit analysis going on in the heads of the people in these companies, if they can pay what is actually a reasonably small amount of money compared to their overall operation in order to keep the old reactors going for as long as possible and still avoid the economic incentives that you're talking about, they're going to do so, and you're not going to get innovation from those big companies. What a flat tax does is it forces everybody to change at the first instance and at the first opportunity. So you can't buy yourself out of changing to a new style of reactor or changing to some kind of geocentric way of capturing carbon. You have to actually make the change when that change is available. Now, moving on to my second major point, why is this actually a better incentive for innovation? Because the fact is that for innovation to take place globally, we have to have a global incentive for that innovation to take place. And what you do by creating some areas, no thank you, where people are actually going to be reducing, and other areas where they're not going to be reducing, and we know that these things are often geographical. It's related to how far away you are from the mine where the coal is, what natural resources are available in your area. What happens is that you don't actually get the spending on innovation that you need worldwide. What we can see is that...
How realistic is it that you're going to get this flat tax agreed to worldwide, politically?
Alright, guys. How realistic is it that you're going to get a worldwide carbon trading system? I was actually trying to avoid that kind of cheap and nasty debating, because we know that nothing that anyone says in this debate is actually going to happen in the near future. If we can get that agreement at all, it's just as likely to be on a carbon tax as on your system. Why? Because the only example of your system is in the EU where it's failing, and the examples of our system are in Norway and California where it's working. So if you want to talk about practicalities, we'd say they go to our side of the house. In terms of my last point in this debate, and that is about substitution and flexibility. The fact is that when you're talking about land and whether you can use certain types of land, as we heard from the first proposition speaker, and you're talking about factories and how factories are actually going to operate, then the substitution and flexibility principle just doesn't get enough carbon reduced. The first reason for this is on a more macro level. The fact is that when you have a cap, it is much easier to lower or raise that cap based on political pressure from within any given country. It's much easier for people to renege on their deals than if you have a flat tax across the entire world. It's one of the major reasons why we don't like substitution and flexibility. We want a tax that everyone can know what that tax is and that everyone can see what that tax is. And this relates to the way in which the first proposition speaker talks about regulation. It will be, under either of our models, very difficult to regulate, and we're going to admit that right now. But the regulation system would be pretty much exactly the same. You need the technology and the mechanism to tell how much each factory is actually reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. But the fact is when you factor in the need to enforce a really complicated quota system, then that gets much, much harder than when the tax is flat across every firm in the world, across every country in the world. So what have I basically told you today? We've said that an economic incentive which actually incentivizes some people to produce more carbon dioxide, while incentivizing other people to produce less carbon dioxide, is not a real economic incentive. We've said that the cap, which is the actually only way in which you're actually reducing these emissions, rather than just moving them around, could be moved quite easily, and in the only instances we have been set way too high. And we've said that if you want a real incentive, one for real innovation worldwide, not just some ghettos of pollution and some other places where they like innovation, then you're going to go with a flat tax plan.
I'd like to thank the Leader of Opposition and call for the Deputy Prime Minister. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. At least we're talking about the end of the world. We're doing our best to make it suitably, apocalyptically exciting, ladies and gentlemen. We're very sorry, we'll do what we can. Now, in continuation with this theme of apocalyptic, I can't even say it, destruction, we're going to have a little bit of a look at what we've just had from First Opposition. But as Ranald has identified, I'm going to go on and talk after that, ladies and gentlemen, about the third world, about economic growth there, and how we, in fact, ladies and gentlemen, do think they deserve economic growth. Think it's quite a good idea, and would like to provide a mechanism for helping them do that. See the model, it's a great idea. No, really, honest, we like it. We do think development for them is important and good. But before we come on to that, let's have a look at what Evan Gold gave us. Because the first thing he gave us was, no, your model won't work. Right-wing governments will be nasty. Now, we basically stood up and said, will your model work? Because essentially the two models are the same. The two models are top-down solution imposed from on high by a body which people get to sign up to. So I'm afraid my only response to you, Evan, is no. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we accept that there is going to be the occasional wanker who gets to sit in the White House. But, ladies and gentlemen, there are a few important things to consider. Firstly, there is a general acceptance across the Western world that this is a problem and something should be done about it. And there is an acceptance throughout a number of states. Nobody's standing up. Well, no, thank you anyway. There's a general acceptance throughout a number of states in the US that this is something they should do something about. And that's why we're going to let people like California join. But further than that, ladies and gentlemen, we say there are a number of other benefits to this idea. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, we say that multinational corporations from the Western world who do business across the world are also able to be part of this scheme, to buy into the scheme, and are compelled to buy these carbon credits. But also, you want an example of where it's worked. The United States has had a sulfur dioxide credit trading system operating for quite some time. They've managed it quite well. The fact that the EU is a bit crap and got it wrong doesn't mean that we can't look at the EU and go, aha, we know what the problem was, we'll fix that problem by having a central authority, a fixed number of credits, and make that number smaller year on year to actually bring down growth. Like, the argument that the EU are idiots is not an argument against a better, more intelligent trading system as proposed by Ranald. So finally, ladies and gentlemen, we want to talk about why flexibility is actually a good thing rather than a bad thing. And this is simply, ladies and gentlemen, that we recognise that the needs of companies are different. They would like to impose a tax upon every company at the point of output. We would like to make companies pay to be allowed to output. Those are essentially fairly similar systems, but we say an important distinction is that the company is allowed to assess exactly how much they need to put into cleaning up their act, to put into reducing their emissions. And we say this is quite important, given that we like companies to be able to continue growing, and we would prefer not to impose massive harm on companies. Because if I have a company that considers it more economically useful to buy lots of credits than to reduce my emissions, I can do that. They take a larger slice of the global emissions and someone else doesn't get to buy those credits. That's how a market operates. It drives up supply and demand, and the price offsets no thank you against itself. And we say that ability to be flexible, that ability to make the decisions of what is important to you as a company is something quite important in terms of allowing our economies and allowing our industries to remain flexible, to set their own goals, and also to be given this incentive. Like, if you clean up, you have to buy fewer credits. That's less money you spend, and that's, a good thing for you. Go.
Yeah, they already go for this scheme that we're talking about in Norway. Is there any reason to believe that all these companies going out of business where that's just simply not the case?
Like, we think ours is better. We think it's more flexible. We like it more. That's why we proposed it instead of a flat tax. Like, we think it's a good thing. More than that, ladies and gentlemen, and we want to talk a little bit about the third world. Because we recognise on this side of the house that the third world does need to develop. And we're not terribly keen on stunting their development. We accept that they're going to need to have this position. We don't think it's terribly fair for the first world, which is producing, between Europe, the US and China itself, 55% of the global CO2 emissions. We don't think it's fair for us to say to them, you're not allowed to develop and we're going to tax you to stop you. But what we do think, ladies and gentlemen, and we do accept a need to help them and a need to direct their development in a more sustainable and a more positive way. And this works twofold, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, through in terms of Western companies going in there. No, thank you. We would like Western companies going in there, which are under the idea and have become part of a carbon trading system. But more than this, ladies and gentlemen, we're specifically and deliberately funding and funneling the resources that we are generating through this into sustainable development, into actually helping them to grow in the ways that everyone says are good, but is doing absolutely nothing to foster and absolutely nothing to help out with. And that, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll take somebody in just a second, that is a further good. I will take something.
Okay, given the short-term costs of restructuring environmentally, why would businesses opt into the system that you're putting forward?
Well, it's not a short-term cost. You buy a carbon credit today, you buy another one tomorrow, and you're buying them for the rest of time, because we're not making this a one-time deal. We're making this a policy that applies to the world, and we're bringing down the carbon credit, the number of credits available. Like, it's not a short-term cost if you keep having to buy it, nor is it a short-term cost, because the reckoning is that if global temperatures go up by about 5 degrees, 10% of global GDP disappears owing to further economic and environmental disruption. So, like, it's not a short-term cost. It's the rest of eternity, and not to dramatise this, but the fate of the planet, and with the planet, your industry. We think people might like to, preserve their industry, even if not their planet. Ladies and gentlemen, we think our system is a pretty good system. We think our system speaks to the needs of our economies and to the needs of our countries. And we think ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, it fosters a better world. It's a system that people can buy into. And it's a system that does help actively, in a real financial way, the development of the third world. Yay us! We stand for saving the world.
Well, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, Bob's refutation of the extremely brilliant points that Evan brought to this debate seemed to sort of boil down into na-na-ni-na-na. I'd like to say that it's a little bit disappointing to see that the sort of influence that Ronald has had on Bob, and I think we all know who used to wear the pants in that relationship. Ladies and gentlemen, in this debate I want to extend Queensland's case by talking about two things. Firstly, about why, in terms of long-term change and in terms of developing nations, this system of a carbon tax does actually work significantly better than a trading scheme that's already been proven a failure. And secondly, the importance of saying why we should actually have a system where we make very clear in our society that the polluter should pay, and they should pay in a punitive system like a tax, rather than a happy-clapping trading system like the propositions. But before I do that, I want to deal with a couple of pieces of rebuttal. I will then be weaving quite a bit of rebuttal actually into my substantive matter in a beautiful tapestry of debating. But before I do that, I want to look at a couple of issues that Bob gave us in terms of, well, why is the tax better? And he basically tried to paint the cases as two things. And we said, no, they're actually not the same thing. There's a great deal of dispute in the international community and in countries across the world as to whether or not we should adopt a carbon trading scheme or a carbon tax. And we've given you a number of reasons why. Sit down. It's very important that we actually go with that carbon tax. And they told us, well, innovation will come out of this carbon trading scheme. And in saying that, and na-na-ni-na-na, they completely miss all of the points that Evan made in terms of why innovation will actually come about through a carbon tax system that does actually hit everybody. You can't opt out, ladies and gentlemen, of a carbon tax system where innovation will be worldwide because competition will be worldwide. No, thank you. To reduce your costs and therefore compete more effectively in the marketplace. They missed that. No, thank you. Oxford might like to try it. But what we also point out is that in talking about flexibility, we don't believe that companies actually should have choice, thank you, no thank you, or flexibility when it comes to issues of climate change. They did a beautiful picture of painting this apocalyptic, and I can't flick my hair like Bob does, but an apocalyptic sort of image of the world, and we agree. So it's not acceptable to have a carbon trading system where companies, no thank you, can make determinations as to what they're willing to pay and what they're willing to trade. We want to impose a punitive measure. But what did they tell us in terms of why their system was actually different to a carbon tax? And they said, well, multinationals can play. Well, they can under a carbon tax too, ladies and gentlemen. And they told us, well, we think that the sulphur dioxide trading scheme was a great success. Let's talk about that sulphur dioxide trading scheme. Because what we would say actually happened there was that credits were significantly underpriced. They were underpriced to the extent that people weren't trading enough under the scheme, and within 5 years, that scheme actually fell apart. What's even worse for these guys, in terms of that example, is that in saying, well, sulphur dioxide was reduced overall, and use of that was reduced overall, simply doesn't come about because of the carbon trading scheme. It comes about because a new source of clean coal was found, ladies and gentlemen, and that's a problem for them. So let's go on to look at this idea of take two. Quickly.
Why does it make sense to raise the cost of production equally for every single firm on Earth when it is so much easier for some firms to continue providing the same services more efficiently and damaging the environment less?
Because, guys, no clap, it wasn't a good POI. What we would say, ladies and gentlemen, is that's not actually what happens in this case. Evan gave you a lot of analysis as to why that's not the case, and I'm going to go on to look at why that's not the case now. But what I do want to talk about is developing nations, because when we talk about what this actually does to developing nations, what we say is that they are giving developing nations some kind of insidious financial incentive to never reduce their carbon emissions overall. Even if we look at the fact that perhaps they need a certain amount of carbon emissions in order to develop overall, no thank you. What they're actually saying is, well, try to, on the political level in the international community, argue up the amount of carbon emissions that you're allowed because there's a financial incentive to do so. You can sell them, you can make money out of them. It doesn't suit developing nations, ladies and gentlemen, to over time actually reduce the amounts that they are allowed to emit, because over time that reduces the profit that they're allowed to make under their carbon trading scheme. And we think that's insidious and it doesn't help the problem long term. What we would further say is that if you want to help developing nations in the international community, we already have systems with which to do that. US $530 million a year is being provided in funds to actually assist developing nations to develop renewable energies and to develop cleaner technologies. What we would say is that we need to continue to support programs that do that so that these countries can develop economically, but not at the same time allow them to actually continue to make a financial profit out of having a certain amount of carbon emissions. Random.
Part of the solution would have to be producing new technologies. First world companies are in a better position to do that than developing world companies.
Okay, that point just doesn't really make sense. It's not a mutually exclusive question. What we would say is that we think that companies in the developed world should be incentivised because of the kind of competition Evan was talking about to innovate. At the same time, we've given you $530 million worth of funding to develop technologies in the developing world. You can do that without the carbon trading system and without providing the financial incentive they talked about. But let's talk about this idea of the polluter paying. And this is where there is a significant, very clear difference between what they're proposing and what we're proposing. Because we think that climate change is a problem and it is somebody's fault, ladies and gentlemen. The United States is responsible for 24% of global emissions, the EU 14%, China 13%. What this does is it sends a message, as tax does, to say that it is an individual problem in terms of nation states, but also in terms of individuals. What we've seen over the past few years and months is an individualising of environmentalism. This has had a significant impact in building support for climate change overall. The problem with the carbon trading system is that it sends a message that it doesn't matter who emits, so long as something gets done about it. We heard from Ranald in his speech, in his POI to Evan, well, it doesn't matter who emits, when it's emitted and who emits it, so long as we deal with it eventually. What we're saying from Queensland is that it does matter who emits that. We believe the polluter should absolutely be responsible for paying for it. So when we can sum up the proposition case as na, and we can sum up the opposition case as responsibility for climate change, we want to put that responsibility with the polluter, and we want to do it in a way that encourages innovation in both developed and developing nations. We beg to oppose.
He said that nothing in this debate will happen, nothing is going to change. What we're going to show you is that what can change and what real change is. Because carbon trading is the only way to continue to secure growth and reductions in a way that we can change attitudes of individuals and companies and states in a sustainable way, which is the only natural way of reducing environmental impact in the long term. This debate is about how to change the attitudes of individuals who use these particular elements. It's how to ensure that individuals change the way that they pollute. And we're going to show you on this side of the house that it's only with economic growth that individuals get to that state of development where they start thinking about green issues and when they start thinking about the environment. Let's firstly deal with this idea, first a couple of points of rebuttal. They said that an economic incentive must be universal, and that's why we have that carbon tax. We say that there's two problems with their tax. Firstly is that it will hurt growth. Why does it do this? Because it affects unproductive elements in the same way as it affects productive elements. And we think that's particularly problematic. And second, because it doesn't allow any flexibility. They also told us that developing countries have to reduce now, as otherwise they won't do so in the future. We say if that's the case, then why are Western countries reducing emissions now? It's not like that has been the case. But more importantly, we think that the fact is that reducing emissions in a developing world has a very different effect on the economy of that developing country than reducing the same amount of emissions in the Western world. And we say that a flat tax disproportionately hurts the third world, because whereas Western companies are able to build into their models and build into their economic production a natural way of ensuring that they reduce the environment, they hurt the environment less, that's not the case in the developing world in their system. But finally, on our argument on underpricing credits, well, we say on this side of the house that the market is always much more likely to find the right price for a harm to society than the government, especially when there's an element of trading. So what are we doing on this side of the house? Firstly, what we say in this proposition is that we need a mechanism which is going to allow the market to continue to operate while correcting a market failure. But at the same time, no thank you, it has to ensure that growth is allowed to continue. Carbon trading allows growth to continue by decreasing the disconnect between pollution and growth, no thank you. But whereas other limits on growth are unnecessarily punitive. On this side of the house, what we are arguing for is a situation where you can have growth under carbon trading and thereby attitudes. So how best do we affect attitudes in the long run of people in these environments? We say that the best way to fight climate change and the best way to ensure that there's environmental development is by having growth in countries. It is only once individuals in these countries have moved on beyond their most basic needs in terms of securing food and the like, only when growth becomes part of their psychological logic, that they are able to then start worrying about climate change and the environment. We see that in the case, no thank you, of the West, where green politics is now an issue. It's an issue simply because the event horizons of individuals have been extended. Because, no thank you, when we have growth, as we have continue to allow on our side of the model, individuals act as if there is a future which exists where they have to act as if long-term goals need to be considered as much as short-term goals.
Is that build new stuff. The point of our plan is you can't build new stuff without it being greener and more environmentally friendly stuff, which you're putting on for another 20 years.
No, we're not, sir. Under carbon trading, there is going to be a reduction in the amount of carbon that is in the environment. But what we are doing is we're ensuring that the most productive elements are the ones that get access to the resources necessary for growth. We're ensuring that if you are productive, you can have growth at the lowest possible cost to the environment. Under your policy, what you do is every single company, no matter who you are, has to bear a similar burden, which we say disproportionately harms certain companies. So what do we see? We see that if, no thank you, we have growth, it becomes more plausible for individuals to look to the long term. What is the point of all this? The point is that once this happens, individuals start holding their governments to account on climate change. States start acting as if climate change is important. But they can only do that in a situation where there is a tomorrow. They can only do that in a situation where economic growth continues to be viable. You can't expect the Indian government to execute the policy that you want to execute on your side of the house if they have in the back of their minds the idea that there may not be the possibility for growth in their situation in the next 100 years. Because if they don't have growth in their economies, there's no way for them to look after individuals, and there's no way for these individuals to be able to continue to survive in this particular environment. But what we also say is we do need more interdependence of states and more interdependence of companies and actors for an effective policy such as what we're proposing. And what we say with carbon trading is that you do just that. You create an interdependent market between states and between companies and between other actors, no thank you, which doesn't exist under your model. Yes, ma'am?
When multinational companies in the West buy out the majority of these credits, how does that help developing nations?
Well, we say firstly that it's not necessarily the case that all of these companies are going to buy out all of the credits in the developing nations. Why? Because who is far more likely to be able to build in the innovation and the technology change to be able to secure these problems? It's the companies in the developed world. They are the ones who are going to be able to afford innovation. And if they can make a cost-benefit analysis and show that it is more effective for them to innovate than to purchase these credits from the third world, they will be able to do it. The problem with a universal tax is that third world nations do not have the ability to procure these rights to pollute. They don't have the ability to be able to develop their economies in ways which the West has been allowed to develop for hundreds of years. So what have we said on this side of the house? We've said that what we fundamentally need to do is to change the attitudes of individuals and states and actors in order to secure climate change in the world today. And we've said the fundamental premise is that you need growth in societies to be able to secure that. You need people to move onto a higher economic plane where they can start extending their environment, their event horizons, and make long-term interest. We say that it's only with the system of carbon trading that you have both economic growth and a phased reduction of emissions. We beg to oppose.
It is a pleasure to be the highest performing G team at this tournament. The flip side of that, of course, is that we're also the worst performing G team at this tournament, so let's not dwell on it and get on to the extension of the closing opposition in this debate. Like the closing government in this debate, what we recognise is that when corporations take environmental movements, they pass those costs on to consumers. And what we're going to analyse at closing opposition in this debate will be what will those effects on those consumers be, how they interact with the model that the proposition put forward in today's debate, and why ultimately will a flat tax be better in terms of how the environmental movement garners the support of that important consumer base, which the corporations stake their profits on. But before we do that, let's quickly turn to two questions that the proposition has raised in this debate. Firstly, it's just something that Anna and I want to question. Will this proposition curb the problems that the EU suffered in the massive failure of the scheme they introduced in 2005? And secondly, will this lead to growth under carbon trading, the massive assumption of which the extension of the opposition was predicated on? Yes, sir.
Aaron conceded on our system because it isn't a flat tax which uniformly raises the cost of production, there's going to be more growth in our model. How is that controversial?
Well, I'll get to that. Well, how is it more controversial? Well, I want to be more. If you don't have a proper response to my point about what about Western multinational companies buying out all of the things and stifling the development of the third world when they get demand to that access, maybe that point would stand. But let's first turn to the assertions that were put forward by your opening government in this debate. Firstly, they told us, well, this solves the problems of the EU because the government doesn't give them to companies. You've got to buy them now. First point that Anna raised in this debate, what about companies that just factor the costs in? What about the big fish? We say they're not hit by this model and they're not forced to kind of have the environmental accountability that the biggest polluters must have, as our opening opposition stated. But secondly, we say they still control the price. And when it's a precarious political situation in companies, given the close relationship with big business and companies across pretty much every Western country in the world, we think that that gives an incentive to the governments to appreciate the initiative that the companies have taken and disproportionately compensate by making the prices simply too low. And that's the same problem as we saw in the EU. In fact, what you proposed was worse than the EU, because under your model, the government doesn't control how many people buy in. At least this side of the House has had the guts in this debate to say you've got to make sure those big polluters are on side if you want to see real environmental change. And that very big problem of this problem of opt-in, opt-out came. But what effectively we said, and Anna's second point of information in this debate, is where was the incentive? And they said, well, the incentive to restructure your economy didn't necessarily need to exist for those corporations because they could just buy lots and lots of them. Surely the incentive in this debate is profit, and they told us that they wanted to sell those carbon traders. If that incentive is profit, then they are going to have to restructure the economy of those corporations. They're going to have to restructure how they practice things. And that's an immediate short-term cost. That's a massive disincentive for the opt-in model that you proposed. And I'm now dealing with your extension, so take a seat. So, then we heard that the growth under carbon trading would make it work. They said it makes the environment a problem. And as I said, that's predicated on a false assumption that carbon trading causes growth, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, we just question outright whether countries like China and countries like India, or even states within them, are going to opt in under your model. But more so than that, as Anna raised a point of information, when Western multinational companies, Women's Human Project, buy out the majority of profits and force these companies to take environmental standards, that's what actually cripples the third world. This side of the House told you, don't let the third world develop with the promise of tomorrow you restructure your practices. Make them develop with environmentally sound practices from the beginning, and you'll save them the massive costs of restructuring later. Because with that, I turn to the extension of the closing opposition in this debate. And that's the first question about extension is, why will the costs be passed on? That's quite simple, Mr. Speaker. That's because, in terms of getting under those caps and having that profit incentive that the Prime Minister set up in this debate, you need to restructure your industry. It's another production cost that you're adding on. What does that mean? Is that you add that cost onto the consumer. And with an opt-in, opt-out model, that's incredibly problematic because you create this false incentive for consumers to buy from environmentally unsound companies who aren't passing those costs on. We think that this kind of misguided policy in the US and Canada, where suddenly you see the biggest cars ever, like those SUVs are freaking large, that resulted, Mr. Speaker, because there wasn't a universal application like we propose, but rather they taxed very highly light engines, and everybody started buying very big engines, and now there are SUVs everywhere, and suddenly you've realised the damage that misguided opt-in policy has done, and that's why we need the universal model. Yes, sir.
Taxation cost is also passed on. Then if the consumers rebel and the tax gets reduced by a right...
No. When you pass it on universally, you don't create an incentive for consumers to use environmentally unsound companies. That's a better model. That's better political backlash. And this is what leads me on in terms of consumer responsibility. We think it's really important in this debate that consumers incur that responsibility and everybody incurs it equally. So it's not just the people who think it's savvy to buy green bags and savvy to buy hydro. It needs to be everyone who incurs the cost equally. And there can't be that market disparity between environmentally sound and environmentally unsound. And that leads us to the final point of our extension today, is what about the backlash? We say exactly what undermined Kyoto was that mentality of Americans, and Australians to be fair, that said, but China's not signing on, parochial nature of the United States, but you have states like California opting in, but Oregon not. The voters of California are going to begin to ask very quickly, why am I paying more when in Oregon this car costs 15% less? We say that's where you get the consumer backlash that undermines the precarious political support for the motion. Mr. Speaker, in this debate it's been very clear the opening opposition from Team Australia told you that this didn't help companies because the biggest polluters were targeted in a punitive sense. They told you it didn't work for the third world, and what we brought you at closing opposition is why this doesn't work for consumers, because it creates a false incentive to use environmentally unsound companies. And for all those reasons, Team Australia is very proud to oppose.
We think they might be a little closer than they might have seemed at first. But anyway, we think it is a problem. Firstly, because we think that our model allows the market to continue going on with a slight restructuring of incentives. A slight restructuring we think is really great, but crucially allowing reductions to be made where they do least damage to production. Right? So you get continued economic growth and you get change, as opposed to their model, where they limit growth across the board, where it's productive, where it's unproductive, in the service of climate change. So we think that the two kind of differences between our system is firstly that it is more flexible. And they said there are all kind of problems with flexibility. So that's the first burden. Why is flexibility grand? But we say there just is more growth under our system. There just is, because you don't put a uniform cost on everyone. We say some firms, no thank you, are going to be better able to shoulder the costs of restructuring along ecological lines and others, so the incentive for them to buy those credits is going to be different for them, right? So there will be more growth under our model. So that's the twofold burden, that's what we're going to look at. But firstly, let's kind of just brush out of the way this kind of whole who's got the silliest model issue. I know. Firstly what we say is how do you get big, grand, global government stuff? And what James told you was the way you generally get it is when states have congruent interests. In this sphere, we say the best way to do it is when you have congruent economic interests. That's fostered when economies become more dependent. A process fostered by continuing to get the economy to grow. But we also say that states generally, this is an issue we don't see why China will opt in. Well, A, give a crap. It's the model. Debate the model, which is that all the states opt into it. No, thank you. But we also say that states are much more likely to opt into a system which allows them to continue growing economically than your system, which says that they can't. I didn't get it either. Okay, right. The ocean of flexibility. Does it matter where carbon is reduced? And what we said was it doesn't matter where the carbon is reduced, because it all goes up into the global atmospheric miasma. But what they said was, no, you set economies like China and India on the wrong development path. And what I'm going to show you in the second point is why any development path is the correct one. This is what James told you. Any development path is a precondition for getting people to give a crap about the economy, the ecosystem, even. No, thanks, Sarah. But we also said that, there are sort of human harms, right, to reduced growth, wherever it happens. People lose jobs, firms reduce output, prices tend to rise, all that kind of stuff. The economy generally contracts, and we call that an economic harm. That's a massive human harm, right? And we say, why does it make sense, no thank you, to increase the costs of production equally for all firms when economies in some places are harmed less by reducing those carbon emissions than others, ladies and gentlemen? We don't know why that should be the case. We don't know why a firm that can create less economic harm by reducing carbon in exactly the same way shouldn't do that, and allow another firm that would harm the economy more by reducing carbon could thereby be allowed to continue doing that for now. No thanks. Actually, no, yeah, go for it. Oh, the lady, why not?
Instead of the environment, when your model creates a market distortion where environmentally unsound companies
Oh yeah, I loved this. Yeah. Environmentally unsound products will be cheaper. We say no, because you have to buy the credits in order to produce them. Really like that this is something which is bought by firms rather than states, because we think firms are traditionally much better at spotting where efficient production happens and where restructuring can be made efficiency. We love the free market. I'm told it's grand. No thanks, okay. We say that the costs of restructuring, right, are lower for firms in highly complex economies that have specialised staff, like the complex technological stuff, so that they can run stuff like geothermal reactors, so they can run stuff like the massive system you need to put a tidal power plant in place. We say, that's great. Why not let the restructuring and the reduction happen here? And then first off said, oh, well, technological innovation has to happen everywhere. We go, why? Like, firms operate in America and also operate in China. No, thank you. The kind of Sydney idea that MNCs are evil and will buy up all the credits, we think works in our favour, because the crucial thing about MNCs is they're multinational, right? We think they might buy all the credits and use them in the developing world. Okay, we think our system is grand, therefore, because those that need it, those that need to be able to pollute without, and those that can do that, take the credits and all that stuff, and that's lovely. Right, let's talk now about the notion of increasing growth. No, thank you. Because we say, how do you get China and Russia and all those people to actually stop polluting? We say the way you did it in Europe, and the only way you can do it is by promoting as much growth as possible. Firstly, just because of the notion there being preconditions to an economically sustainable economy, stuff like levels of technology, stuff like all those specialised staff, and all that stuff. But also because of the stuff that James told you, the notion about there being a side effect to economic growth, which is to say that getting climate change, real climate change, either on a global level or at a local level, requires political will. It requires people to give a damn. And we say, firstly, when you restructure the incentives of firms, they're more likely to give a damn. But also we say that affluent economies, right, like places like Europe, are the only places where green politics have developed. Because it's only after you have a house and food to give to your children that you start worrying about the environment. It's only after, crucially, when the economy is stable that you start worrying about, 30, 40, 50 years of our lives, rather than your short-term economic interests, your event horizon extends to worrying about your grandchildren's interests. We say that the developed world is the only area willing to shoulder the costs of economic restructuring, and that's why. It's a simple brute fact that Europe developed under, polluting models, and, that didn't hinder its transition now to less polluting models. So when they say these countries must develop under models of economically sustainable growth, ecologically sustainable growth rather, we're not quite sure what that means. We think that there's a direct correlation between the economy growing and the economy then being able to go green. First of all, because technology requires it, and second, because that's the only conditions under which people care about it. And on this side of the house, we think if you're going to do anything genuine and substantial about not just climate change on a carbon scale, but climate change in terms of smaller, more things like desertification, all that stuff, people need to care. You need to restructure the incentives that people care about. So, because our system's flexible, and that's great, and because our system allows growth to continue unhindered as possible, and that's also great, we're very, very happy to propose.
As much as I enjoy debating in Canada, that would be the only attempt at bilingualism, because quite frankly, at the opposition whip, I have far too much to get through to say everything twice. On that note, we had a government team today that needed to show us that both growth and change were effective under a carbon trading model. They tried to have their carbon credit in EDA 2, ladies and gentlemen, and on that they simply failed because they were unable to prove either of those. We proudly stood behind Team Australia today and said that taxation and a punitive measure was the way that we got real change. More than that, at the closing opposition, what we pointed out was an acknowledgement that consumers and people of the world, not just companies, had to be encouraged to change their behaviour. And the way we interacted with companies in terms of getting pollution and punishing pollution had to have that framework in mind. And we were able to show that under our model, that's where you got the most change in behaviour. So with that in mind, what I'm going to do in my whip speech is look at three areas. Firstly, this question of consumer and changing behaviour. Secondly, the idea of growth and how you magically make it happen all over the world. And lastly, the problems of a carbon trading system and why theirs simply don't address those. So let's look, ladies and gentlemen, at this question of how this actually interacts with economics. Because what we said is that these costs get passed on, ladies and gentlemen, and that was all the points of information that Julia and I brought out early in the debate. What this said was an acknowledgement that restructuring or buying the carbon credits was going to be passed on to the consumers. The problem with the opt-out model, the opt-in and opt-out model, ladies and gentlemen, was that then you created a niche market where people could actually make their products cheaper by not signing on. But even if we were to accept, ladies and gentlemen, that magically everybody signed into this, they needed to show us that for most of the companies of the world, it was cheaper to restructure than to buy out the credits. And what Julia and I pointed out is for most Western countries, that simply isn't the case. So that means that their products, ladies and gentlemen, don't get the same costs factored in because they're not having to do with restructuring. And then what happens then, ladies and gentlemen, is you get the same effect of those consumers not having to change their behaviour. The point of the matter is, ladies and gentlemen, more than that, is what we showed you was that there's this close relationship between governments and big business, particularly in terms of also if they think business is given a little in political capital, which means that those credit costs are going to be set at a level that means that restructuring is preferable, or that innovation is preferable, and the government fundamentally failed to give us any indication why that was the case, and I'll take the closing.
Doesn't your op also require everyone to sign up and a close relationship between firms and businesses?
Well, if you were listening, I went through why practically we didn't think it was the case, and then I decided that I'd actually show you that even if everyone joined up to your club, you failed in your burden to show that those credits would be priced appropriately and necessarily priced appropriately to get that change. What our model does, ladies and gentlemen, is ensure, and it admits that costs will be passed on, but they're passed on uniformly when you have the punitive model of a flat tax, ladies and gentlemen. When that happens, the price of everyone driving their SUVs or running their air conditioners in their hotel rooms to 35 degrees is passed on to everybody. We take that particular context, people start to change their behaviour, no, sit down. We take that context, that's when you get the sort of also political will that we think is necessary to have further changes. Coming then secondly, and that's where our last point in terms of backlash came in, to looking at how we can't afford to have a system where people think that some people are carrying the costs and other people aren't carrying the costs. That's where you have the major problems that come, ladies and gentlemen, of things like the Asian Development Pacific Nations Pact, in which people are walking away from systems like Kyoto because they think that some people aren't carrying the burden of it. And I'll take the opening team now.
We say credits are far more politically robust than taxes because once they're privately owned, there's a private incentive to keep them that way.
No, what happens, ladies and gentlemen, is those prices are manipulated, reflecting the fact that governments and business have that interaction. You've never been able to show us why that's not the case. Then we came secondly to this question of growth, ladies and gentlemen, and particularly the closing government wanted to say to us, well, hang on, this is just how it works, and magically you're going to have growth everywhere. As Julia pointed out, that's not the case, because the restructuring doesn't get covered by the people who should be best at restructuring. It gets done by the people who can't afford to buy out the carbon credit regime, ladies and gentlemen. So what happens isn't a market working effectively, it's a massive distortion of the market, which means that lots of people don't go around restructuring when they should be, and in 30 years' time they're probably going to have to, and there's a massive long-term cost in that, and then the wrong people are forced to be doing the restructuring. So in that particular context, who's hurt in particular is the developing world, because say in that sort of context that companies don't have the money to take on those particular short-term growth. And the only answer that these guys had was, well, no, that's because innovation happens, and that's where the incentive comes from, ladies and gentlemen. That's not empirically true. We have to subsidise massively things like wind power, because at the moment, innovation, ladies and gentlemen, just isn't economically viable, and that means that the sorts sorts of restructuring that these guys think will happen under their trading scheme simply isn't the case. More than that, ladies and gentlemen, we said what happens is that this is therefore incredibly detrimental in terms of developing nations' growth. And we say it punishes the wrong people in that particular context. More than that, it means that the developing world gets away with, in some contexts, ladies and gentlemen, not doing the restructure that we say they absolutely have to do. And environmental degradation in the developing world and unsustainable growth is the worst sort of policy in any context that everyone in the world should be advocating for these particular group of people. And then we came lastly to this question of this is okay because carbon trading schemes and trading schemes in general worked rather than taxes. And we were able to bring to the House a lot of points as to that was the case. Julia in particular looked at why the actual problems of the EU in terms of the way the prices are set and oversupply and the relationship between big business and whoever's selling those credits were never solved in this particular context. We're saying that what's going to happen is that the price isn't able to be, and the market isn't able to work in the way that the government wants it to. And in that particular context, you've undermined the ability of everybody to shoulder the blame, ladies and gentlemen. You're not encouraging growth and the right sort of growth in the developing world. For all of those reasons, we say a tax, not a trading scheme, is the answer to the environmental problems of the world.